Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. I am happy to welcome you to our event today. My name is Pamela Crivelli. I am economist at the Asian Development Bank, and I was part of the team working on the Asian Economic Integration Report 2022 team chapter on advancing digital services trade in Asia and the Pacific. I will be there and I will be your MC for today's session that will feature the key findings of this chapter. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first distinguished guest, Dr. Theo Park, who will be delivering the opening remarks of this webinar. As the first president of the Lee & Co Global Commerce Institute, Dr. Park and his team monitors new developments and trends in global trade and investment. They analyze major international trade dispute cases and provide in-depth advice and strategic insights to the Korean and foreign enterprises in connection with their trade and investment related planning and concerns. Dr. Park is an internationally renowned trade expert and, among other accomplishments, is a Seoul National University professor emeritus. He has extensive experience in serving as public official, working on trade policy and negotiation matters. Dr. Park has served with distinction as Minister for Trade of the Korean government between December 2011 and 2013, and as the Ambassador at Large for International Trade and as the Chairman of the International Trade Commission of Korea. Let me mention that more details about speakers' profile are also available on our webpage, event webpage. So now, Dr. Park, I'm happy to welcome you. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction. Good morning and good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are now. Let me begin by thanking the ADB for inviting me to this important event. First of all, I would like to congratulate ADB on the recent release of the Asian Economic Integration Report 2022, focusing on advancing digital services trade in Asia and the Pacific. I believe this is a timely report, especially at this critical juncture when the importance of digital services trade is increasing. Today, I would like to share with you some of my thoughts on digital services trade and its role in developing countries' economic development. I would also like to briefly discuss several issues regarding aid for trade programs. As you are well aware, the global economy currently faces multiple difficulties. The IMF has just released its revised World Economic Outlook for this year, which looks much worse than its prediction made in April of this year. The delayed recovery of the global economy will put more pressure or more burden on developing countries. Meanwhile, as the global economy is being rapidly digitalized, digital trade has been on the rise. In particular, the proportion of digital service trade through data transmission has greatly expanded since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Trade experts expect that this trend will not be reversed even after the pandemic is over. Therefore, it is important for developing countries to overcome economic recession and upgrade their industrial structure through actively digitalizing their economies. Of course, some developing countries have already recognized such importance early on and have become major exporters of digital services. According to the ADB report, before 2014, India lacked expertise in digital services and relevant infrastructure compared to East Asian countries such as Japan, Singapore, and Korea. However, now about 81% of its services exports are done through ICT networks, thanks to the rapid growth in computer and ICT services. And the Philippines has also emerged as a leading country in business process outsourcing. In this regard, Aid for Trade project may need to pay attention to the role of digital service trade in economic development of developing countries. This is particularly so since digital services do not require large-scale physical resources or infrastructure compared to manufacturing industries. And furthermore, their transportation means and trade are simple and inexpensive. Therefore, an active promotion of digital services trade can be a good economic development strategy for developing countries. Since individual aid recipient countries are in different situations, having different needs, it would be most important for Aid for Trade project to identify the priorities of each country in terms of their needs. Unlike the leading digital services exporters, such as India and Philippines, many countries in the Asia-Pacific region still have a manufacturing-centered economy and show weak performance in digital services, digital service trade despite their high growth potential. As you know, services trade of developing countries have been mostly exports of labor services through Mode 4. However, with the rapidly growing digital technology, time has come to actively pursue digital services trade through Mode 1. If the Aid for Trade project can contribute to this so-called mode switching for developing countries in the Asia-Pacific region, they can achieve substantial outcomes. In this regard, it will be crucial to establish proper internet networks in developing countries and to reduce trade barriers in both exporting and importing countries of digital services. Here, I would like to bring your attention to the suggestion that the Aid for Trade project invite experienced experts who can work with local people in the aid recipient countries. For example, Korea has many professional people with real business experiences who had now retired from the ICT-related fields. They are willing to help developing countries. Experienced experts from overseas could make more contribution to digital innovation in developing country than capital investment. In addition, liberalizing trade barriers would be also very important. Over the past 10 years, WTO has tried to establish multilateral norms on digital trade, but little progress has been done. Now, bilateral, plurilateral, and regional agreements on digital trade are being signed among mostly developed countries. We find that most of these agreements adopted the core principle of free flow of data. On the other hand, most developing countries maintain data localization regulations. We should keep in mind that in order to promote digital services trade, these regulations must be modified. A desirable policy direction would be to accept the principle of free flow of data with supplementary measures such as protecting private information. In this context, Aid for Trade project should provide a clear explanation on the importance of flexible policies on digital services to developing countries. I strongly believe this will help strengthen the domestic digital services industries in the future. Lastly, but not least, I hope today's event will help Aid for Trade programs consider effective ways of promoting digital services trade in developing countries, especially in Asia and the Pacific region. I also look forward to hearing useful policy recommendations for developing countries. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bark, for these insightful remarks. I think you rightly highlighted the challenges we are now facing in the international trading system, but also stressed that digital services might be part of the solution and they can play a key role in recovery, and Aid for Trade would be also crucial in this context. So it's now time for us for the ADB team to present our our key findings of our theme chapter. And we will do it in a very condensed way with a short 2-minute video. I hope you will enjoy it.
Rapid digitalization during the COVID-19 pandemic is expanding opportunities for digital services trade. Cross-border services are increasingly delivered online instead of physically. These include financial, legal, information and telecommunications, health, education, and other business services. Digital services trade can contribute to economic welfare and development. There are many potential synergies between digital services trade and other sectors. Growth in digital services trade in Asia and the Pacific is among the highest in the world. However, digital services trade as a share of total services trade in Asia still has room to grow. Closing the gap requires improving competitiveness in digital services. The region needs to invest more in human capital and ICT infrastructure. Policy and regulatory reforms are the key to higher competitiveness. International cooperation can reduce barriers to digital services trade, promote system interoperability, and ensure fair taxation. Challenges must also be overcome to realize the full potential of digital services trade. Economic and social inequality between those with and without digital skills may worsen. Growing digital services trade calls for renewed attention to cybersecurity and privacy. What does it take to ensure that digital services trade contributes to inclusive growth in Asia and the Pacific? To find out, read the latest Asian Economic Integration Report.
So, thank you very much for playing the video. I hope you enjoy it, and it's now time to move to the rest of our program. I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Henry Gao. Professor Gao is a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation and is a professor of law at the Singapore Management University. With law degrees from 3 continents, he started his career as the first Chinese lawyer at the WTO Secretariat. As a leading expert on digital trade and e-commerce issues, he has been an advisor on digital trade issues for many national governments and international organizations. Widely published on digital trade issues, he also sits on the advisory board of the WTO Chairs Program. And he is a member of editorial boards of the Journal of International Economic Law and the Journal of Financial Regulation. Henry, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Premilia, for that really kind introduction. Greetings to everyone from Geneva, where I am for the annual meeting of the WTO Chairs Program and also for the Aid for Trade Global Review. So I'm going to talk about the digital trade regulation and cooperation. This is the topic that I discussed in the background paper that I drafted for the ADB when we were working together on the Asian Economic Integration Report last year. So what I will do is that I will walk you through part of the report because the report is a bit long, impossible to cover in 7 minutes that I was allocated. So instead, I will focus on a key part of the report, which is the mapping of the digital trade provisions in the trade agreements in Asia Pacific. For this mapping exercise, I cover basically all FTAs with chapters on digital trade since 2000 by the main players in the region. These include China, Korea, Japan, India, Australia, New Zealand, and ASEAN as a whole, Singapore, Vietnam, and Malaysia. The mapping also covers the mega FTAs in the region, that is the RCEP, CPTPP, USMCA, and the EU-Canada Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or the CETA. as well as the two standalone digital trade agreements, the DIPA and the DEA, using the CPTPP and USMCA as the benchmark. The mapping groups the digital trade provisions in the trade agreements into 4 categories. First are the 6 provisions designed to create a facilitating environment for digital trade in general. And this is what I call digital trade facilitating provisions. These include the provisions on the elimination of customs duties on electronic transmission, non-discriminatory treatment of digital product, domestic electronic transaction framework, electronic authentication and electronic signature, and paperless trading provisions. These provisions provide the necessary regulatory and technological environment to enable the smooth functioning of digital trade, which also form the bedrock on which digital service trade can be conducted, as mentioned by Minister Bark just now. The second are 5 provisions to minimize the commercial and regulatory burden for digital service trade providers. And these are what I call digital trade regulatory barrier provisions. These include those on access to and use of the internet for e-commerce, free flow of data, prohibition of data localization requirements, prohibition on forced transfer source code, and open government data. These provisions focus on the most common regulatory and commercial obstacles facing digital service trade firms. By removing these obstacles, digital services will be able to flow more freely across countries, creating massive economies of scale with the data that they amass across the different markets. Now, among the major players, you can see that these provisions are what the US most interested in, and especially in the US-led FTAs such as the CPTPP and the USMCA, you find that these provisions feature prominently. The third group are the provisions to protect the interests of consumers, and this is what I call the consumer protection or the consumer trust provisions. These include provisions on online consumer protection, privacy and personal information protection, and unsolicited commercial electronic messages. By addressing the main concerns of consumers, these provisions enhance the trust of consumers in digital service trade and therefore indirectly boost the take-up rate of digital services among consumers and among the major players. As many of you know, this is what the EU is most interested in, as demonstrated by the famous GDPR. The last category includes 4 provisions to preserve the regulatory autonomy of the government, such as those on cybersecurity, exceptions, and cooperation. These provisions help the government to reserve the policy space necessary to address various social policy objectives, even though they might ostensibly be inconsistent with the various obligations under the digital trade chapter. And among the major players, China is the best example for this, because you find these provisions in many of the China FTAs, especially the RCEP. Now, as a result of the mapping, let me show you the charts that I did after I reviewed all these FTAs. As you can see, these 4 categories of provisions actually have a different popularity among the FTAs. I did 2 charts. The first is the percentage of FTAs with at least 1 provisions in each category, and one is a percentage of FTAs with provisions in at least 1 to all categories. So 1 category, 2 category, all the way to 4 categories. So if you look at them, you can see that the first category is the most popular among the FTAs surveyed, with more than 3/4 of the surveyed FTAs include at least 2 provisions in this category. There are several possible reasons for this. The first is that many of these obligations are not entirely new, but actually repeats existing obligations in other international agreements. These include the Ancestral Model Law on E-commerce 96, the United Nations Convention on the Use of Electronic Communications and International Contracts, and the WTO's Trade Facilitation Agreement. Moreover, these provisions lay down the infrastructure necessary to facilitate digital trade and do not prescribe a specific regulatory approach on sensitive issues, So therefore, they face the least resistance from the bureaucracy and are genuinely welcomed by the governments all over the world. At the same time, even though these provisions can help developing countries foster their digital service trade, there could be problems in implementation. The first is that the implementation of some of these provisions might require additional investment into hardware and software, which can be a challenge for some developing countries. This challenge can be resolved by applying for loans from the development banks. Second, many having these facilities might not be sufficient. Instead, the statutory requirements on documentary formalities might also need to be modified to take into account of the new ways for contracting and approval. As many developing countries lack the experience and experience in this regard, they might need technical assistance from the relevant international agencies. The second type of provisions do facilitate digital service trade by taking down regulatory barriers that blocks or impairs trade flow. The problem, however, is that the primary beneficiaries of such measures tend to be mainly overseas service suppliers, which supply their services through the cross-border supply mode. This could raise a host of economic and social issues, such as crowding out domestic services suppliers and therefore taking away both the sales and jobs, reduction of government revenues as the overseas service suppliers are unlikely to pay value-added tax or income taxes, suppressing the development of the local e-commerce suppliers and raising the hurdles for regulatory enforcement actions as the online suppliers are much more difficult to police. Due to these issues, many developing countries are reluctant to agree to these provisions, which are included in only a quarter of the surveyed FTAs. Again, here, the issue is not just purely economic. The lack of regulatory capacity is also a major issue that regulators in many countries have to grapple with. On the other hand, without these policies in place, the digital giants would be hesitant to enter the local market due to the fear of cybersecurity when data cannot flow freely and additional costs for building local servers. Therefore, many developing countries also do understand the need to agree to these provisions, at least as a welcoming signal to foreign digital firms. To assuage the fears of these developing countries, two things need to be done. First of all, is to educate the officials on the basics of digital trade, especially those of data transfer, so that they understand that even localization requirements would not prevent many of the potential problems associated with the free flow of data. Second would be to help them learn from the regulatory practices of other countries, especially those that can operate at a sufficient regulatory capacity, even with the offshore storage of data, so long as they have immediate, direct, complete, and ongoing access to such data as stated in the USMCA. The third type of provisions do not directly contribute to the development of digital service trade, but by fostering a trustworthy environment for the consumers, they may also make indirect contributions to digital trade by easing the concerns of consumers against digital trade. The problem, however, is that many developing countries often lack the domestic laws and the regulations on many of the issues in this category to start with. So this makes it harder for them to formulate the relevant laws and regulations, and sometimes such regulations are implemented in a way which affects digital suppliers more than the traditional suppliers, which could raise national treatment issues as the latter are typically domestic suppliers. This is also reflected in my survey. As you can see, only half of the surveyed FTAs include at least two provisions from this category, with only, so here, the technical assistance to developing countries would greatly help developing countries as they enter the new regulatory field. The last category of provisions by design boasts the power of the government vis-a-vis the digital firms, and therefore does not appear to be facilitative in nature. But these provisions are necessary trade-offs to respond to the opposition against the provisions mentioned above. Such provisions provide the government the maneuvering space necessary to keep digital services in check, which is crucial for many developing countries as the bulk of digital service trade are provided by foreign suppliers. This also explains the relative popularity of these provisions. More than 70% of the surveyed FTAs include at least one provision in this category, and even more if the general exceptions clauses in the other chapters are included. So to foster the development of the sector, developing Asia would need to beef up the provisions in the second and third categories. Of course, given the complexity of digital service trade, it would be unrealistic to assume that the mere inclusion of these provisions would definitely boost the trade levels. Instead, these need to be complemented by the other efforts, such as building up the necessary infrastructure for digital trade and putting in place the appropriate regulatory environment which strikes the right balance between the risk control and market liberalization. Given the low levels of service trade in many of these countries, it is probably a good idea to start with the market liberalization at the regional level first. This could be facilitated by mutual recognition agreements on services, which so far has been restricted to among rich countries. Countries with similar regulatory frameworks can develop such recognition agreements at the bilateral and regional level first before expanding them to a wider level. And I hope that my sharing today can help some of the countries in the region to expand their digital service trade and to become major players in this field. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henry. It was a very a nice presentation of some of the main findings of our report. I hope they will be insightful for the next part of our webinar, for the panel discussion and Q&A session that we are entering now. With this regard, I would like to remind the audience that the Q&A box is open, so feel free to type any question you may have, and we will try to address them if time permits. This panel discussion and Q&A session will be moderated by my colleague, Rolando Avendano. Rolando is an economist at the Economic Research and Cooperation Department of the ADB. His research focuses on financial and international economics with an emphasis on regional integration, competitiveness, and Asia's impact on emerging economies. Given his expertise, Rolando was part of the Asian Economic Integration Report Team, Chapter Team, that we are discussing today. So, Rolando, I give you the floor for moderating the panel discussion and introducing our distinguished guest. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pramila, and thank you, Dr. Bark and Professor Gao, for that great introduction. So I am very pleased to be your moderator for our panel discussion today, and where we will look and dig deeper on the topic of trade in digital services and its importance in the context of aid for trade. The topic of the session is important, and Dr. Bark has very nicely set the stage of the discussion. We know that Asia Pacific has experienced growth in digital services. Our theme chapter tries to analyze and explore this question on the rise of digital services. And we are very pleased today to discuss with a very distinguished group of experts on how to reach this potential and how a modernized Aid for Trade program can help to attain this objective. So let me briefly introduce our panel today. So please feel free to turn on your cameras. We're very pleased to welcome Jane Drake-Brockman, professor at University of Adelaide. Jane is a recognized expert on trade and competitiveness in services. And among her many roles, Jane is the co-chair of the Asia Pacific Services Coalition, a member of the G20 Trade and Investment Research Network. And she's also very familiar with this audience, given her role at the International Trade Center, where she was brought in to establish the program on services. Our second panelist is Irene Olivan, who is a trade policy analyst at the Trade in Services Division of the OECD. Irene's work focuses on policies affecting services trade, and she manages the OECD's Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, or STRI, as well as the Digital Services Trade Restrictiveness Index. She previously advised and worked in the public and private sector on issues related to data protection, intellectual property, and IT. Our third guest is Dr. Jose Ramon Albert, Senior Research Fellow at the Philippine Institute of Development Studies. Dr. Albert is a former president of the Philippines Statistical Association, and he has extensive experience across Asian economies on poverty measurement, analysis, survey data, and more recently on the issue of digital trade integration. And finally, I would like to ask Professor Gao also to join our panel discussion after his insightful presentation. So I will start with Jane, if it's okay for you. And let me start with a question about the latest WTO Ministerial Conference in June, which adopted important decisions in the area of e-commerce. What were, in your view, the main outcomes from this ministerial for the future development of digital trade in services? And what lessons learned can be important in this context of aid for trade? Over to you, Jane.
Well, Rolando, I think the week of MC12 finally probably put digital services trade thoroughly on the map. It certainly shone a light on digital trade as a global high priority. Let me mention just a few highlights. First, and it might not instantly be recognized as relevant to digital trade, but the first one I want to mention is that 3 more WTO members joined the JSI on services domestic regulation, which completed its negotiations 6 months ago and is focusing now on implementation of a new GATS reference paper on services domestic regulation. Now, this is critically important in reducing trade costs for all services, but it is definitely going to impact also on digitally enabled services, including computer services, and can be expected to help all WTO members edge towards better regulatory practice for the new economy. So I would see that as very much part of the agenda on digital services trade. MC12, of course, also saw extension of the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions, which remains of fundamental importance in facilitating digital services innovation in particular. That extension came with a decision to further develop the e-commerce work program, including to conduct in-depth studies on the WTO moratorium, looking inter alia at, for example, its impact on developing countries. I'd also mention perhaps the 3 co-conveners of the WTO negotiations on e-commerce, Australia, Japan, and Singapore, issuing a statement that week reporting on progress to date, which is very real, and expectations going forward in terms of what they might focus on next. And in a sense, Henry has outlined that agenda. I mean, as he's explained, there is much negotiation going on at regional level all around the world. And the kinds of provisions on the kinds of subjects that Henry raised is exactly what's under discussion in those e-commerce negotiations in Geneva. And I think it is very relevant that the 3 co-conveners really stressed the importance in that statement of digital inclusion. They stressed the importance of developing country participation in the negotiations. And together with Switzerland, they launched a new capacity building framework designed to do exactly what they're calling for, strengthen digital inclusion and help developing and LDC members of the WTO to participate more closely in these negotiations. And they did specifically say that the underlying objective was to support developing countries in shaping policies that create a conducive environment for digital trade. So what are the lessons in all of that for aid for trade? Well, clearly the e-commerce conveners considered that existing traditional mechanisms were insufficiently focused on digital trade, with negotiators clearly seeing a very real need for new programs and actually moving to establish them. But more broadly, of course, the outcomes at MC12, the e-commerce work program and the ongoing negotiations, this really calls on developing countries to participate and to engage effectively. They do urgently need more dedicated capacity building on what is best practice policy and regulatory settings. This means aid for trade will also need to be more focused on the soft infrastructure required for digital connectivity, I guess, not just the physical infrastructure. I was interested yesterday listening in the plenary session. The WTO Director General asked us all to think more deeply on how trade can be brought to bear as part of the solution for development. And she specifically drew our attention to the need for aid for trade to focus more on digital trade connectivity. And I recall her mentioning that the WTO review showed that growth of aid for trade funding associated with digital connectivity had actually grown very significantly, over 30% since the pandemic began, but it's still only 1% of disbursements. 1% of disbursements. Is it really any surprise then that the poorer developing countries are struggling to participate in the WTO negotiations on e-commerce? And of course, if they aren't effectively contributing to the development of new rules in this area and are left out, the cycle will only continue and the regulatory gaps will widen. So no wonder the co-conveners of those negotiations initiated new action. And no wonder they're specifically focusing on the enabling environment for digital trade. And no wonder the ADB is calling for a radical redirection in aid for trade activities that focus more on digital policy and regulatory settings. We've got to get that 1% up. So in a nutshell, Rolando, I want to add that aid for trade programs that seek now to redirect towards digital trade, they really should go as a first port of call to the groundbreaking theme chapter on digital services in this year's ADB Economic Integration Report. It is the go-to resource. It is precisely focused on gathering all the available evidence and extending that by publishing lots of new research results to identify the key drivers of an enabling environment for digital services trade. Now, I've written and spoken a lot over the last 2 decades about the driving factors for services trade generally, and I've long been an advocate for greater flows of aid for trade to the services sector. But what's so interesting to me about the ADB report is it's the very first publication to focus specifically when services go online, as they all increasingly have, and when they start to dominate the trade and value-added data on overall trade, then what are the driving factors for competitiveness specifically in digital services? And in a nutshell, I mean, this report brings together not only all the statistical evidence, a lot of business surveys, a lot of country case studies, but in a nutshell, from the firm level perspective, and I learned at ITC to focus on the firm level perspective when it comes to aid for trade. But it's the uptake of new technologies and transformation to new business models is largely a matter of having rapid access to key business resources, which are digital skills, startup finance, and data. So what Aid for Trade needs to do is address the constraints affecting access to these resources. And it turns out Many of them are found in policy and regulatory challenges in the local economy, associated with human capital development, associated with building a thriving ecosystem for innovation, and in designing regulatory regimes that are fit for purpose in the new digital economy. So from a trade perspective and an aid for trade perspective, the ADB kind of boils it down to 4 critical areas that all interact with each other and are all in need of attention. The first one is the efficient digital regulatory framework and the issues there, whether it's consumer protection, privacy, security, or taxation. It's about meeting key benchmarks for international best practice and building high levels of business and consumer trust. A high degree of regulatory transparency really matters for trade. So is the extent to which regulations are interoperable with regulatory regimes in trading partners. The higher the degree of divergence of a country's digital regulatory regimes with regimes in place in trading partners, then the higher the cost of doing international business. The same with standards. The more that local standards differ from international norms, the harder it will be to trade. I think I will wind it up there. Is that what?
Yeah, no, these are extraordinary points and really comes to full circle on what we had worked on this and what are the current discussions at the MC12. A lot of focus on capacity building, as you mentioned, rebalancing also between the participation of developing countries and also some lessons in that regard, also in the reduction of costs for key services, including computer services. And this will lead me to our next panelist, which is Irene, who has worked a lot on these issues of computer services. So Irene, you have conducted extensive work on barriers to digital enabled services, as mentioned by Jane. We have an idea of how Asia Pacific compare, but perhaps you could give us a bit more information. You recently completed a study also on digital rules for OECD, including also Asian economies. And one of the questions is, what are the opportunities and limitations that we see in this emergence of digital agreements? And if there is a risk of a possible digital noodle ball, as we have talked about in the case of trade agreements.
Yes, thank you very much, Rolando. Thank you, Jane, for this.
Well, perhaps while Irene reconnects and computer services, we will see, perhaps we will move to Jose Ramon, and we will get back to Irene's intervention. So Jose Ramon, you work on the Philippines in particular on studying the readiness for digital trade integration, has brought also a valuable country perspective in this discussion. And you have also gone beyond the normal regional and rules that we have studied so far in our report. Could you share a bit about these main findings on the strengths and limitations in the case of the Philippines, and how have these favored or also affected the country's potential to develop further digital services?
Thanks, Rolando. Our study at PIDS was supported by UNESCAP. We made use of the framework of ESCAP's Regional Digital Trade Integration Index for examining the Philippines' readiness for digital trade integration with the Asia-Pacific region. We identified 3 of the main strengths of the Philippines' position on digital readiness. First, its exceptionally low tariffs on digital goods that synergizes well with having only slightly restrictive non-tariff measures. Second, continuous improvement on its intellectual property rights enforcement that complements the country's liberal access to online content. And third, the country's strong cross-border data policies and domestic policies on the use of data. In fact, the foreign private sector perceives the Philippines' policy environment for data to be one of the best in ASEAN. On the other hand, the Philippines is not doing well on certain issues pertaining to foreign direct investments. We do have foreign equity limitations, particularly for retail trade enterprises with paid up capital of less than $2.5 million, for instance, they're prohibited from having any foreign equity. And in certain circumstances, foreign equity and electronic commerce can also be prohibited. For instance, leasing and subleasing advertising space or operating on online voucher platform intended to increase the sales of a particular product or service can be considered mass media activities, which unfortunately are prohibited to have any foreign equity. Second, we also have second issue is that we have public procurement policies that affect foreign bidders' participation. While we do allow participation of foreign bidders, public procurement for digital goods and services are often skewed towards domestic bidders, which may have an adverse effect on competition. And third, we do have strong barriers to entry that restrict the Philippine telecommunications sector from developing, thereby undermining an important part of the digital economy. And consequently, the Philippines generally has an open policy environment for digital trade, but there are also a lot of barriers and bottlenecks that need attention. Since e-commerce is an important part of digital trade, all of these restrictions on foreign investments can certainly impede the digital economy's growth, thereby making digital trade integration rather difficult. But with these barriers to entry, not only do they prevent healthy competition, but also restrict our telecommunication sector's growth. And in fact, the Philippines finds it currently difficult to attract foreign investments in this sector. But we are hopeful that some amendments on the Retail Trade Liberalization Act and the Public Service Act in our legislature might be able to address these bottlenecks. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Jose, and that brings a lot of interesting points on the pluses, like in terms of intellectual property, data flows, for example, which is a major concern in other economies, but not in the Philippines, and also other areas that perhaps we haven't explored as much in our report, like public procurement and FDI restrictions on foreign equity limitations and competition. Let me go back to Irene. Now you are with us. So going back to the digital noodle bowl question. So over to you.
Yes, apologies for the IT connection issue. It comes back to the infrastructure and the need for connectivity in digital. So hopefully you can hear me correctly now.
Yeah.
So the OECD indeed has carried out extensive work in measuring and monitoring the evolution of policies regarding digital trade. So the main tool that we use for this monitoring is, as Rolando was mentioning in the introduction, the digital STRI, so the Digital Services Trade Restrictiveness Index. This index captures the main barriers to cross-cutting barriers to digital trade, and in particular barriers to infrastructure and connectivity. That, as Jane was mentioning, is one of the most important elements and restrictions that are necessary. So they are enabling factors to be able to participate in digital trade. So this index currently captures 100 countries, and it shows interesting evidence on the regulation and the trends in the region for Asia and the Pacific, and also in the global economy. So I will put the link to the report just in the chat, but as a very general, the most general points on the region, and then I'll go on to the noodle bowl and the risk of increasing complexity of more FTAs and digital economy agreements. So just on these main results, what we see from the data collection in the Asia and the Pacific region is that there is a very highly diverse regulatory framework for digital trade. So some countries, some economies have a very open regulatory environment, while others have a very restrictive one. Also, what we see since the beginning of the monitoring of these policies, so since 2014, is that there is a clear tendency towards a more restrictive regulatory environment for digital trade. This steady buildup of restrictions has seemed to slow down in the recent years, in particular since 2020 and since the COVID pandemic, when many economies did put in place measures that facilitate at distance transactions. So this is the main findings. Also, some of the main restrictions that we did identify are the requirements to install branches or agencies in the country. That all increases the cost for companies to carry business in the country, as well as what was mentioned before, the increased restrictions to data flows, and in particular, the requirements to localize data in the country. So regarding the increase, free trade agreements with e-commerce provisions, as well as the new digital economy agreements, what we do see is that this has increased and therefore shows that it has become a policy priority to create global rules for digital trade. What we also see is that this proliferation of agreements can create a challenge for businesses, as it can increase complexity of the applicable trade rules. However, we should also see that many of these agreements don't include hard provisions, as it could be in the case of trade for goods and rules of origin provisions. So here, what we also see is that most of the restrictions and the important barriers to digital trade actually come from domestic policy. So they come from applied domestic regulation. And as Jane was saying, this is also another aspect of the negotiations at the WTO that these agreements can really help the implementation and the development of digital trade and trade rules. So what we are seeing is that adequate domestic policies that effectively protect consumers, protect personal data, and protect competition in the digital economy are really important and are really necessary to create trust for users to actually use and engage in digital trade, and in general to create an enabling regulatory environment for digital trade. So this is why the work of the OECD is mostly focusing on compiling information on regulation across economies, and also on quantifying the benefits and costs of regulatory barriers to trade. So what we are trying to do is to understand and propose evidence on how what would be the gains of improving the domestic regulatory environment. So in that sense, those economies and those governments that are willing to make reforms, to see what would be the gains of putting the domestic regulatory environment closer to international best practice. So in that sense, just in a nutshell, this may be possible noodle bowl of digital economy agreements and digital trade agreements. We see it as less problematic compared with the need of implementing domestic policy reforms. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Irene. That's a very interesting point. And I mean, we are very aware of all the work you are doing in terms of data collection, the inventory for digital trade, and many other sources of information in this regard. Maybe let me just invite the audience also to participate. Please raise your hand or include your question in the chat box if you want to ask anything to our panelists, and I will give you the floor. Maybe just move quickly to Henry, and going back to one of Jane's points at the beginning of her intervention on the capacity building as an objective. You see, we have talked about the complexity about these agreements, implementing them. What are the support areas? I mean, you have identified some main areas. You have also worked on each of these. What are the key support areas that you see that the economies in Asia need more to assess the benefits of these digital economy agreements? Or where do you identify these capacity needs that are so important?
Thank you, Rolando. Indeed, you do see a lot of increased interest in the region, on joining these digital economy agreements or implementing them. I mean, over the past few years, I personally have been involved in advising, several countries in the region, ranging from upper middle income country to LDCs, which are all very interested in this. So I think in terms of the main areas of demand, the first one would be the infrastructure, which is a key, as Minister Bark actually has noticed in his opening remarks. So I wouldn't repeat them here. But another key issue, because I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to speak from the regulatory perspective, is the upgrading of the regulatory capacity. I mean, we see that many countries in the region, actually, the officials are not familiar with the lingo of digital trade regulation, or actually with the meaning of different provisions in all these digital trade agreements. I mean, these sometimes just, look at the provision on its face, and they get the wrong idea. They think that, this means that, they have to sign up to an obligation which is actually more restrictive than the one that is in the agreement, or that, they will be prevented from doing some of the things which actually are perfectly entitled to be doing under these agreements. So I think there is a lot of demand, for further explaining, what this provision means, and also sharing the best practices by some of the, leading countries in the region, such as Singapore, which has been doing a great job in terms of, leading the signing of digital economy agreements and sharing the experiences, so that we can alleviate the concerns of some of these countries on the restrictiveness of some of these provisions, and they can also participate in the negotiation and also in the implementation of these provisions as well.
Thank you, Henry. That's an excellent point on how we can identify some of these capacity gaps at the government level. And that brings me to perhaps the last question that I would like to ask all the panelists, that is more broad and related to the Aid for Trade discussions we've had in the last couple of days about how to make these benefits of Aid for Trade more broad, how to benefit those who are more in need in terms of economies, but also marginalized sectors of the population, small businesses. Where do you think these technical assistance gaps could be allocated, or what type of capacity of technical assistance, could be allocated to really have this objective of what Jane called the digital inclusion as an objective for Aid for Trade in this context of digital services? Let me start with Jane.
Thank you. It's a big question, and time is really short. So I think what I want to say is that when it comes to regulatory reform, when it comes to structural reform, there are always a lot of domestic constraints, political headwinds that make the whole process difficult. And I therefore feel that technical assistance capacity building has to be really well equipped with an evidence base, an empirical evidence base that can really help at all levels of audience in the countries where capacity building is going on, understand what the global evidence is, what the outcomes are likely to be from one reform or another. And so I really do just want to say, go back to that theme chapter in the ADB report, because the evidence base that is gathered there is absolutely extraordinary, highlighting the very strong correlations that exist globally between lower restrictiveness of regulatory regimes and stronger trade performance. But I think that I would like to mention the need for upskilling. Everywhere what is needed is a more people-centric, a more worker-centric focus on human capital needs for the future of work, for innovation, and for locking into opportunities in global value chains. And this is one kind of activity where I think the private sector itself can help, where there is much scope for public-private partnership in local workforce investments required. I'm going to leave it there so everyone has a chance to speak.
Thank you, Jane. Those are very good points. Let me move to Jose Ramon.
Well, in my humble opinion, the donor community probably needs to facilitate the development and adoption of statistics and data on digital services trade. While the business community and the private sector engage in digital cross-border trade and transactions, there's still no universally accepted measure of digital trade and even of digital platforms and the digital economy. It can be difficult to manage what we don't measure and what we don't measure well. Attention on measurement issues can clearly further facilitate digital trade.
Thank you. I fully identify with that message. Let me go to Irene.
Yes, thank you. I was exactly going to say that I fully agree with this need to be able to measure and to provide evidence on what are the actual needs, so to be able to target the aid. And more generally, the two main areas to focus this capacity building, but also aid on the development would be for developing infrastructure and connectivity. As this, we cannot forget that it is really the basis to enable and to be able to carry out any trade that is digitally enabled. So on the first hand, infrastructure and connectivity. And then also, as we were mentioning before, it is necessary to be able to support and develop regulatory frameworks, national regulatory frameworks that are fit to facilitate and enable digital trade. So those would be my two main areas of attention.
Thank you, Dennis. And Henry?
Thank you, Rolando. Well, my distinguished panelists have already spoken a lot on this, which I fully agree. I would only add that there is a strong demand to enable the trade ministry talking with the line ministries, because especially with the digital service trade, the expertise typically is covered by the line ministries instead of the trade ministry. So there is really a need to, try to get them to talk to each other, to understand each other. And actually, ADB has been doing some of the great work in this regard, including some training courses that Jing and I have both, lectured in, where we designed courses, for example, for central bankers, for the different ministries, finance ministry, and so on, to help them to understand the meaning of the regulatory issues. I think that is really the key, because frequently when you negotiate this agreement, you have to spend a lot of time negotiating with your colleagues in the other line ministries, to have them to buy in to all these commitments. So I think this would be crucial, so that they understand what they are getting themselves into, and they will not be scared, to agree to all these new commitments. And hopefully with that work continued, we can help the developing countries achieve that.
Thank you, Henry. I think we have one question in the chat box. How do you reconcile the WTO moratorium objectives and the possible revenue loss by developing countries and LDCs and its impact on the digital economy value chains? Who would like to take this question? It's a good question. Maybe Jane? Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to start. I think a lot more work needs to be done on the revenue implications of the moratorium, or of having a customs duty on digital services. There have been a number of studies. The one by UNCTAD, initially, one by OECD, another one by Simon Evan of the Global Trade Alert. And the general, there is so much difference in the estimates there that we clearly need more work. I don't think we should rush to any big assumptions about how much revenue is actually being lost. The general feeling is it's been overestimated. So I look forward to the new studies that the ministerial decision has called for.
Okay, so more work on these estimates will be very needed. Henry, you have your hand.
Yes, thank you, Rolando, and thanks to the question. Now, I would echo Jen's comment, regarding the studies, especially the OECD has done an excellent study, on the revenue implications, and their finding is that actually the revenue explanations has been exaggerated because I mean you have to look at from the a whole picture perspective. I mean, I understand that some developing countries are already concerned with the revenue implications, but if you broaden it, if you reduce the barriers to e-commerce, you can achieve much more, in the overall economy rather than, just the loss of revenue. And also, since the question talked about value chains, I mean, you have to understand that nowadays, the way the value chains works is not one way, right? I mean, you have to import, let's say, many parts and components, and then you export them. So if you charge tariff on this part and components, that would also be accumulated into the final product. And actually, at the end of the day, I mean, it's consumers or the downstream industries which would take, all these additional tariff burden. So I think, basically a broader whole picture approach has to be adopted when developing countries think about this issue. Also another thing I often tell developing countries is that you don't really have a choice because especially look at Southeast Asia. So many countries want to attract, the big, e-commerce platforms. So if you do not create a facilitating environment, your neighbors will, and you will lose out. Your sellers, your buyers, your consumers would all lose out in this. So you really have to consider it from a systematic perspective rather than just a focus on the narrow revenue implications. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Henry. So my takeaways from this discussion also on digital inclusion, digital skills, statistical capacity, interministerial collaboration, and interdisciplinary approach to these issues is important. And I think this is something very important to keep when we talk about this soft infrastructure that is needed to develop the potential of the digital economy. We are asking ourselves this question ourselves in ADB. So this is very important for us to guide also the policy discussions and how we can also work in establishing these better standards and also combine with other areas that go beyond trade and that perhaps we have discussed today in terms of cybersecurity, digital identity, e-governance. These are still areas that we have not explored enough, but they are very linked to the topic that we have discussed today. So on that note, let me thank you everyone for the very fruitful discussion today, and apologies for taking a bit more of your time. Let me conclude by thanking all the panelists and for your insights and for taking the time to be in with us. And we hope we will continue this dialogue with you in the future. Thank you to our audience, and thank you for being with us. See you next time.